Sons. Dr. Tatum, welcome, and we are thrilled to have you with us tonight. So let's get started.
Well, thank you, first of all, for the invitation and the warm welcome and introduction, Dean Alavi. I really look forward to our conversation.
So, as a renowned authority on the psychology of racism, you argue that straight talk about our racial identities is essential if we are serious about enabling communication across racial and ethnic divides. But you also talk about a language gap that makes it hard to have this conversation. Please talk about the language gap and tell us how we can then address this and have constructive conversations.
Sure. Well, one of the things I did in my book is spend the first chapter, not the prologue in the new version, but chapter 1, really defining terms, because in my experience, teaching about racism and also leading workshops and doing the kinds of community engagement opportunities, activities that I have been involved in now for more than 40 years, I find that many people use words where they think they're talking to each other about the same thing, but they're not. So one person is calling something racist, somebody else is talking about prejudice, somebody else is talking about discrimination. The words are used interchangeably, but they really mean different things. So I find it helpful to articulate at least what I mean, and then even if someone has a different set of definitions, they understand, at least we can understand what each other is talking about because we've been clear, transparent about what we're talking about. So I like to talk about the difference between prejudice and racism, for example. Prejudice is an attitude, a set of attitudes, often based on stereotypes, limited information. We think of racial prejudice as negative attitudes. Theoretically, someone could have a positive prejudice, I suppose, but we generally think about this as negative, and often, as I said, based on limited information, usually based on stereotypes. We all are exposed to this misinformation. If you have grown up in the United States, or even if you've grown up somewhere else, it's likely that you have been exposed to misinformation about some group different from your own. That information may have come in the form of jokes people tell or images you saw on the television, stereotypical images you saw in the media. But we all get exposed to it. I talk about it as being like smog in the air, or in Atlanta, maybe pollen in the air. If you live in a smoggy place, you're going to breathe some in, whether you want to or not. So we are all living in this smoggy situation. But racism is more than that. It's not just prejudicial attitudes. Racism is about policies and practices that systematically advantage one group over another. In the context of U.S. society, certainly we talk about racism as systematically advantaging white people, systematically disadvantaging people of color. And those systemic advantages come as a result of policies and practices. Sometimes people think of racism as individual acts of meanness. And so someone will say, if I'm not calling anybody names, I'm not actively discriminating, I'm not doing bad things, therefore racism is not an issue. But in fact, people might feel very positively toward people of color or other groups, other marginalized groups, and yet still through their behavior reinforce policies and practices that put those groups at a disadvantage. So it's understanding the systemic nature of racism that is important to the conversation. One of the things, if I might just say something more about this, because I think it's important, when I was working on my 2017 update of my book originally published in 1997, I sought out feedback from faculty members who'd been teaching my book. And a number of them said, whatever you do, don't take out this example because it's so helpful. And that example that I want to share right now is the example of a moving walkway, let's say at the airport. You step on that moving walkway. If we think about racism as being like a moving walkway, policies and practices that are fueling our society, making access to employment or access to education or access to loans or access to all kinds of things more difficult for people of color. That moving walkway was operating before any of us was born. But if we imagine that we are stepping onto that moving walkway, we are being carried along by it. And some of us are maybe actively embracing the ideologies, the white supremacist ideology that fuels it. And we might think of those people as walking fast on that moving walkway. We might think of those people as actively reinforcing and supporting racist ideologies. But there are other people who are not walking fast. They're maybe just standing still. And it's those people who will say, what racism? You know, I'm just standing here. I'm not participating in this process. But because it's in motion, they're being carried along. There are other people who will see that racism is in motion. They'll see that cycle in motion, and they'll say, you know, I don't want to participate in it. And they'll turn around. But unless they actively walk in the opposite direction, they're still being carried along. It's only when you're actively interrupting the process that you can say you're working against racism, that you're anti-racist, or that you're interrupting the cycle of racism. So I think it's important to underscore this, because I think there are lots of people who think because they have been inactive, they have not participated in racism in our society. But the fact of the matter is, unless we are actively working against these systems that have been in place a long time, we will be reinforcing them, even through our passivity.
Okay. That example was truly illuminating. So let me kind of follow up. You used the term white advantage. You have discussed the nuances of white privilege and white advantage. Please expand on those for us a little bit.
Sure. Well, the term white privilege, of course, refers to the benefits, the advantages that come as the result of that system of racism. Many people in my teaching experience, I found that many of my white students really struggled with this idea of privilege, because sometimes they didn't feel as though they had privileges. They didn't feel necessarily that they had benefits. But in part, it was because the benefits were invisible to them. So, for example, if you get in your car, if a white person gets in the car, they drive out in the evening and they come home in the evening, not having been stopped by the police on the way, they don't say to themselves, I've benefited from the system of advantage. No police officer hassled me today. You know, it's just an ordinary day. If someone applies for a job and they get an interview and their resume is not put out of the pile because their name sounds ethnic or African American, they don't say to themselves, I guess I got that interview because I have a, quote, white sounding name. Somebody didn't put my resume to the side. But yet we know that research shows that identical resumes that have different names, one a name that is presumed to be the name of someone white, one with a name that's presumed to be the name of someone African American, get different callback rates, even though the information on the resume is otherwise identical. So these are things that people are not always noticing, but they are nonetheless making their life go a little more smoothly. But I read a book last summer, which I found very interesting. It was by an author named Nolan Cabrera, and the title of his book is White Guys on Campus. And in his book, one of the things that he talks about is that rather than using the term white privilege, he likes to use the term white immunity. And in that, by using that term white immunity, what he's really speaking about is that some of the privilege really is about the bad things that don't happen to you, right? You know, you run in your neighborhood, you don't get shot at. You are spending time with your family on the beach, no one questions whether you belong there. The benefit of the doubt that white folks are given, the sense of assumed belonging that they often feel, even if they have grown up poor, even if they are in otherwise difficult circumstances, there's certain experiences that they will be immune to. That's what he's referencing when he uses that white immunity. And I think that that's another way to talk about the kind of privilege that comes in a society that advantages white people over people of color.
You have also talked about concepts of colorblind and color silent. Please elaborate on those for us as well.
Sure. Well, these terms are terms that I particularly like to talk about when I'm talking to parents, because I can't tell you how many parents, white parents in particular, will talk to me about the fact that they believe their children to be colorblind, or that they are in fact raising their children to be colorblind and think of this as a good thing. But what I like to point out is that, of course, children do notice difference. Not only do they see it, they comment on it. You know, if you listen carefully to 3 and 4-year-olds who are in diverse settings, they talk about the physical differences they notice quite a lot and ask questions about it and point out, you know, why is that person dark, or why is my hair straight and that person's hair is curly? You know, these are questions that children have. They do notice difference. But I also know that many people have had the experience of being hushed when they talk about difference. I sometimes ask audiences, and I want to just take a moment to do this now. You know, we can't see our audience, but if everyone listening to this conversation took a moment and thought about whether they had had a race-related experience in childhood, most people would say they had. When I ask, a classroom full of students, most people will raise their hands and say, yes, I can think of something, a race-related experience in my early years. And if you ask how old they were, most people will say 5 or 6 or 7 elementary school years. Now, if you grew up somewhere else, or, you know, everybody's circumstance is different, some people might say, you know, I was 21 when I had my first experience. But most people, particularly if they have grown up in the States, will think of a childhood, usually school-age experience. And if you ask what emotion is attached to that experience, most people will tell you that there's some feeling of discomfort. It might be sadness, anger, fear, embarrassment, shame, confusion. Sometimes you'll hear somebody say a word like love or friendship, but often it's some word that speaks to emotional discomfort. And then I like to ask the question, well, did you talk to anybody, a parent or a teacher, a concerned adult, about this experience at the time that it happened? Most people will say they didn't. And if you probe that a little further, thinking about children that age, and if you have children of your own who were 5 or 6 or 7, or grandchildren or nieces or nephews, if you've spent any time with 5 and 6 and 7-year-olds, one thing we can say about them is that they're pretty chatty. They don't hold back much information typically. They tend to blurt stuff out. And so here we have people who, at that blurty age, had an experience that was so meaningful that they can still remember it years later, and yet they didn't talk about it. So you have to ask the question, why not? And when you do, most people will tell you something like, I just knew I wasn't supposed to. I knew I wasn't supposed to mention it, or that the adults would be uncomfortable if I brought it up, or sometimes the adult was the cause of the confusion or the distress. But what the point I'm trying to make here is that we learn early that we're not supposed to talk about issues related to it. And so does that mean we don't notice? No. It means not that we're colorblind, but that we've learned to be color silent. That we don't, we've learned that we're not supposed to talk about these differences. We're supposed to pretend they don't exist, or sometimes we just whisper about them. When I was teaching my psychology of racism class, I was often struck by the white students in my class who would want to refer to somebody as black, but they would kind of whisper the word. They'd say, well, she's, like it was somehow something you shouldn't say about another person, as opposed to a description of who somebody is or what they look like. So, so this is a long-winded answer, but I think it's really important to recognize that so many of us have early socialization experiences that teach us we're not supposed to talk about it. And that means when we get to be at places like Georgia Tech and people are trying to have a conversation, we have to in some ways overcome that knot in our stomachs because we are having that memory of this is not a topic we're supposed to be having a conversation about. But can you fix a problem you can't talk about? You cannot. So we have to be able to push past that discomfort to be able to engage with one another in ways that hopefully can lead to productive problem solving.
So how can an organization develop an anti-racist culture? What roles do values and policies may play in arriving at such a culture?
Well, it's a great question, and it is a journey, right? It's not like you can flick a switch and say, we're going from an organization that maybe has, perhaps unwittingly, reinforced racist policies and practices, and now we're going to try to undo that and become an anti-racist organization. One of the things that's critical is leadership. We know that leadership matters. And so if the leader defines the organization in a very inclusive way and says, yes, we live in a society where there is a racial hierarchy. We know that. We are going to acknowledge that that is the wider context in which we're operating. We live in a race-conscious society. But in this space, we are going to try to undo that. In this space, we're going to try to create an environment where everyone has a sense of belonging, where everyone has access to opportunities, where everyone is able to thrive and be at their best in a supportive environment. And if that's our intention, then the question we have to ask is, what are the barriers to that? We might not know what the barriers are. Sometimes you just get used to things, like let's just say, let's talk about admissions policies for a moment. Here we are in COVID-19 and, in this pandemic, one of the things that has happened is that a number of institutions, because of the difficulty with testing, have decided not to use SATs or the ACT or really any standardized testing because it's been so difficult for students to even take the test in the context of the COVID environment. I read an op-ed just yesterday in which the author raised the question of whether institutions would ever go back to using those tools because they may discover that they are able to identify talent successfully, diverse talent successfully, without those tools. And so, but when they were using them, they didn't necessarily say, this is leading to differential outcomes. This is discriminating against those students who have not had access to test prep and the kinds of advanced placement courses perhaps that exist in better resourced communities or largely white, better resourced communities, to get very specific as it relates to race. And so while we might not call our admissions policies racist in intent, they may have been racist in outcome in the sense that they didn't give equal opportunity for students to demonstrate truly what they know how to do and can be successful at. Now, necessity is the mother of invention. COVID-19 has required a different approach. And so now the question we would ask is, what is that approach and how is it leading to the outcomes we hope to have, a diverse class representing all of our constituent groups and in our state, in our nation, or in the world, because I know you've got international students, of course, at Georgia Tech as well. So this is to say we have to do an audit of our policies. and practices and look at what might be working and what might have unintended consequences. That would be a place to start. But sometimes in order to really know what the impact of the policies are, we have to talk to the people who are being marginalized. Let's listen to hear, what the policy is. I'm going to give an example, if I might. I worked at Mount Holyoke College for 13 years, a long time as a faculty member and then dean, and I had the opportunity to serve as acting president there. And Mount Holyoke had a financial aid policy that required students on financial aid to work on campus. It's a common thing to have a work-study job. But the work-study job that first-year students typically had was working in the dining hall, where they were essentially serving the students who were not on financial aid. Now, that might seem a perfectly reasonable thing to do because there were a lot of jobs available in the dining hall, and it was an opportunity for students to earn money. But on the other hand, it did create a dynamic of sort of server and servant within the class in a way that was perhaps sometimes uncomfortable. And was that really the best way to address the work-study needs of the students? That was a question. And so one of the ways we might answer that question would be to ask the students who were doing the work, how are you experiencing this? How do you feel about it? As just an example.
That was a great example, and I have so many other questions that I would have loved to ask you, Dr. Tatum, but I know there are many people in the audience that would really welcome the opportunity of asking their questions. So let me stop here, and now we can turn to the audience and try to get some of their questions answered.
Thank you very much, Dean Alavi and Dr. Tatum. This is already a fascinating conversation. We have several questions from the audience, and before we get started, I just wanted to share that we will be sending a post-event follow-up to our participants, and Dr. Tatum had graciously agreed to provide a curated list of resources that will be included in our follow-up. So if we don't have time to address all your questions during the event, we hope you will review those resources that will help you find the answers you are looking for. And you will find it in those resources. So let me start with one question from the chat. Most people think about race as a zero-sum game with winners and losers. How can we shift that narrative where those with privilege will not think in terms of losing or giving up their position?
Well, it's a great question. And one of the things that I want to say is that racism is harmful to everyone, right? It hurts our society in many ways. So for example, let's talk about mass incarceration. Let's talk about the over-policing of African American communities and the ways in which Black convicts, people who are convicted for crimes, get longer sentences than white people for the same crime, as an example. That's an example of racism within the criminal justice system. One, the over-policing. Two, the longer sentencing for the same crime, the differential treatment. And so what is the cost of that to the white population? Well, all of us, including white people, are spending a lot of money to maintain those prisons. It costs a lot of money to keep someone in prison. And those are resources that could be used for other things, could be used to improve schools, improve roads, improve, our community in lots of different ways. And so when we agree through our passivity, or actively or passively, when we agree that these policies are okay with us, what we are doing is keeping our community impoverished, all of our communities impoverished, because we're using resources in a way that doesn't benefit the most people and causes harm, of course, to the Black community, but has negative implications for everyone. We can think about it in terms of, dollars and cents, but we can also think about it in terms of the ways in which our community is diminished when we don't have full participation of everyone, when we don't have the talent from every community. There are problems that we might be able to solve if we did that we're not able to solve because we are not fully accessing the talent. So that is just, I could go on, but I think it's really important to be clear that when we behave in ways that limit opportunity for one group, there's a way in which every group suffers because we are cutting off the possibility of the benefit that comes from those other communities, those disenfranchised communities.
Okay, next.
Yes, I will go ahead and preface the next question with the result of our poll where we ask our audience what category they participate in, and it's 1/3 students, 1/3 faculty and staff from Georgia Tech, and then 1/3 audience from the larger community. So the next question is, how can we better talk to children to prevent color silence?
I think this is a great question, and this is a place where I'm going to reference a resource. I did a TEDx talk a couple of years ago at Stanford, actually. I was spending time at Stanford, and I did a TEDx talk there. And the title of the talk is My Skin Brown Because I Drank Chocolate Milk? And it is about a set of conversations I had with my own son, my older son, when he was 3, and then another one when he was 4. But it speaks to the fact that these are questions. Why did he ask me that question? Is my skin brown because I drink chocolate milk? Because he was in a daycare center where a white child told him, your skin is brown because you drink chocolate milk. And he came home and asked me if it was true. Well, the young boy who said the thing was not trying to be mean or hurtful. He had seen my son drink chocolate milk and had drawn what he thought was a reasonable conclusion. But it speaks to the fact that children have questions about difference, and we can talk to them about it. We can talk to them about it in very matter-of-fact ways. I said to my son, no, your skin is not brown because you drink chocolate milk. Your skin is brown because you have something in your skin called melanin. Everybody has some. Some people have more than others. It helps protect your skin from the sun. And the more you have, the browner your skin is. And I went on to say, and at your school, you are the kid with the most. And so he was tickled to think of himself as the kid with the most of something. But having said that, there are ways that we can talk to children about difference, but we can also talk to children about racism, which is a harder conversation perhaps. But if we think about the fact that young children, even 2- and 3-year-olds, start to learn the phrase fair. That's not fair. Fair and unfair, right? We can talk to small children about what is unfair. We can talk to young children about the fact that things are happening in the world we see on the news that are not fair. And that's why it's important for us to speak up, because we want people to be treated fairly. And of course, as kids get older, we can talk in more specific ways about isms such as racism, sexism, heterosexism, other isms, classism. Kids can grapple with those concepts, but typically those are more for older elementary years. But even starting with toddlers, you can begin having a conversation that helps them appreciate difference and works against the idea of racial hierarchy.
Thank you, Dr. Tatum. And as a mother of a 5-year-old, I will be putting these to use very soon. So thank you for that. The next question is, another term I've heard used is code switching. Could you please elaborate on what code switching is and how can we as graduate students do something about it?
Well, let's talk about code switching. Code switching is actually a linguistic term, and it comes out of the field of linguistics, and it refers to the fact that people switch back and forth depending on who they're speaking to. Now, I'm going to expand the term, and it has been expanded to talk about not just language. So for example, if someone speaks more than one language and they are using one language with their friends, and then the professor walks in and they start using a different language or a different dialect or a different tone, we might say that they have code switched. And it's a perfectly reasonable thing to do, to use familiar language with people you're close to, your family members, and a different language or different idioms, different way of expressing in a different context. It's not necessarily a problem that needs to be solved. But what can be problematic is if someone feels like they can't be themselves, like I must code switch because I can't bring my full self into this environment. People won't accept me if I wear my hair a certain way. People won't accept me if I dress a certain way. People won't accept me unless I conform to a certain set of standards that have been established by the dominant group. And if that forces me to kind of squelch who I am as a person in ways that are painful, then code switching is problematic. So I think that we have to understand it as a tool that people use, and it can be a useful tool, but taken to an extreme, or taken to maybe not even an extreme, but taken to the degree that it forces you to leave who you are at the door, that you can't be your full self in a learning environment, then it becomes problematic. And what can we do in that case? We can be intentional about trying to encourage students to bring their full selves. I want to use a very small but important example. Let's imagine I have, most people manage my name pretty well, Beverly Daniel Tatum. It's not that hard to pronounce, though sometimes people get Tatum wrong. But let's imagine I had a name that seemed complicated to pronounce, that was unfamiliar to my professors. And maybe because it had different linguistic roots, or because my parents had been very creative and came up with a name that other people don't know how to pronounce. And let's imagine the teacher says to me, your name is too hard for me to pronounce. I'm going to call you X, and I'm going to call you something else. That might feel quite offensive. That's, my name is important to me. And if you value me, you should learn how to pronounce it. It's, it might take a couple tries if I've got a name that's difficult to pronounce, but you can learn to do it. But to simply say, well, it's too hard for me. I'm going to value my comfort over your affirmation. I'm going to use a different name or give you a nickname. And I've seen students do this. I might say that's fine, or sometimes students even offer that. They'll say, my name is too hard to pronounce. You can call me fill in the blank. But I've also seen students who started the semester that way and then started to recognize the ways in which that was diminishing their sense of identity, and then come back later and say, you know what, I don't want to be called that other name anymore. I want you to call me by my original name and from my original culture, from my original family, because that's important to how I define myself. And so welcoming people to do that, to say, this is an important part of who you are, and we are going to make it, I know it's important to you, and I will honor that. It's just a small but important way we can start to reduce the need to code switch.
Thank you, Dr. Tatum. I'm sure the faculty online is heeding your advice. The next question is, the example of the issues with the SAT and ACT marginalizing group of people that you mentioned, it seems like it is so easy to miss out on ways that systemic racism persists. What are some of the ways to really analyze things in our daily life to find ways to be actively anti-racist?
Well, I think it does require some analysis, in terms of looking at not what the intent is, but what's the outcome, right? So I'm going to use a historical example, if I might. One of the things that happened after World War II was the creation of the GI Bill. The GI Bill gave veterans, returning veterans, access to college at college benefits. They had educational benefits, job training benefits. They had low interest loans. These programs were an important part of really building the middle class, particularly the white middle class in the United States in the 1950s. Now, if you look at the policy, the GI Bill as it was written, it does not say anything about privileging white people. There's nothing about the bill or the policy that says it will be administered in a discriminatory way. But the way the bill was written, it was not administered centrally, it was administered locally. So if you were a Black vet living in Mississippi, you had to go to the Mississippi office to get your GI benefits. And in the 50s, we know that Jim Crow was still alive and well. So no surprise that the Black vets in Mississippi did not have equal access to the benefits they'd earned in the military. They, for example, in Mississippi, there were 3,200 loans given for home purchases in a state that was 50% Black. Of those 3,200 loans, low interest loans for home purchases, only 2 of them went to Black vets. That's an amazing number, if you ask me. But it wasn't just a Southern problem. In northern New Jersey, New York, 47,000 mortgages issued, less than 100 to Black veterans. And so when we look at the middle class boosting benefit of the GI Bill in terms of access to home ownership, nothing in the bill that says this is a racist policy, but in its implementation, it was administered in a very discriminatory way, particularly when it said those home loans were intended particularly for new construction homes. Well, where are new construction homes being built? They're being built in suburban communities. And a lot of those suburban communities were established with racial covenants, which in basically said, can't sell to Black people. These are going to be white-only communities. And so nothing in the GI Bill that says we're going to discriminate, but in the implementation, that was the outcome. So we have to look at what's the outcome of our policies? And then working backwards, ask ourselves, if we are, for example, if we're recruiting faculty and we find that our pools are not diverse, well, where are we recruiting? What are we doing that is leading to this result? As I like to say, if you do what you always did, you'll get what you always got. And so maybe we have to look and see is there some new way of doing it that might lead to a different outcome? If I might just offer one example, when I was much younger and a faculty member teaching at Westfield State University, I was tenured there in the psychology department. I was not looking for another job, but I did leave Westfield State to go to Mount Holyoke. And when I left Westfield State to go to Mount Holyoke, it was because I got a letter that crossed my desk that said, "Dear colleague, we are looking for faculty candidates who have an interest in minority mental health issues, who have an interest in teaching about social justice." There was a description that sounded a lot like me. And so I decided maybe I should explore this opportunity, and I did, and I ended up leaving to go to that job, and it was a great professional move for me in terms of the opportunities that opened up as a result. But after I got there, I learned that it wasn't just a coincidence that I got that letter, that in fact the search committee of the psychology department had hired a work-study student to go through the annual convention book from the American Psychological Association to look up everyone who had given a presentation related to minority mental health issues. And anyone who had given a presentation and whose name was listed in the index of the convention book got one of those letters. They didn't just put the ad in the Chronicle, right? They did some research to identify where are the scholars that might add to the diversity of our faculty, that might bring a new perspective. And in a very focused and labor-intensive, to have that work-study student looking up those names, but nonetheless, a very positive result, certainly for me, but I would argue for my institution as well. So we have to think about what our practices have been, what the results, the outcomes are, and if the outcomes are not getting us where we need to go, what we might do differently.
Thank you for that. And you intuitively answered several of the questions from the chat. Let me go to this one, and this is, I think, a natural follow-up, and I will combine two questions into one. So the one question is, what advice would you give to an employee who works in an organization where there's clear bias in promotions and where the leadership is not diverse? Where do you go for help if the leaders are the people who promote the bias? And then the other question was, would you give your definition of bias?
Okay, so it's difficult if you find yourself in a situation where you feel as though you are experiencing bias. And so what do I mean by bias? Discriminatory behavior, where you feel as though there is perhaps, it may not always be intentional, but that there is behavior that is creating disparate outcomes, behavior that is favoring one group over another. If you look at the implicit bias research, that we hear that phrase implicit bias, what the researchers tell us is that it's not necessarily that the behavior is intended to be discriminatory toward the person of color, but that there's a white preference, what they call an automatic white preference. So if I see, there's all kinds of research about this, but let's use the resume. So if I see a resume that appears to be coming from a African American, there's a name that I associate with being African American on the resume. I may look quickly at the resume, but put it aside. Perhaps not necessarily because I'm discriminating against that, but I might look more favorably on the resume in the pile that has a name that I associate, that I imagine, because there's no picture maybe, but that I imagine is attached to a white person. And I might spend more time with that resume, not even intentionally, but because I'm demonstrating this automatic preference. So when we talk about bias, what we are talking about essentially is preferential treatment. It could be discriminatory or it could be preferential, but where groups are not being treated in the same way. And so if you're in a department where the leader is the source of the bias, that's a difficult position to be in. Now, are there people who you can talk to? There might be an ombudsperson in the organization you could talk to about it. If it's a department chair, there's always a dean, right? Dean Alavi knows that if a person's got a concern with the department chair, they might bring their concern to the dean. If the person has a concern with the dean, then, I'm not sure in the structure of a Georgia Tech what the next option is. Maybe there's the provost. Then, eventually my experience in Spelman was sometimes if people were unhappy with what the provost said or did, they send the letter to my office as president. And so the question is, what's the consequence of raising these questions? I will share a story. I've written about it in my book. I mention it, of having been in a department where I was the only African-American woman, the only African-American, in my department, and I was tenured in that institution. And but I was concerned. So I was an associate professor, and of course, associates want to become full professors. But I was concerned about what I saw as discriminatory behavior in a search process. I was not the candidate, I was on the search committee. But I felt as though my white colleagues were behaving in a discriminatory way. And they were saying things like, in reference to a particular candidate, they were saying things like, I don't know, there's just something about him. I can't quite put my finger on it. You know, I'm not sure he's the right fit. You know, these were these sort of vague comments about, in this particular case, a Black man who was certainly on paper more qualified than the white candidate that people seem to favor. And I felt that it was discriminatory, that people were behaving in a discriminatory way. And as a faculty member with a concern about that, I made an appointment to talk to the provost about it. So I wanted to go see the provost. And my department chair learned that I had made an appointment to go see the provost and asked to meet with me, and expressed his concern about why I wanted to talk to the provost about what I saw as a flawed search. What I wanted the provost to do was to call it a failed search and reopen it. That was what I was pushing for. And the chair talked to me about it, and he said something to me. He said, you know, I have hired everyone in this department. He'd been chair a long time. So I hired everyone in this department, including me, right? He'd hired me too. And there's not a prejudiced bone in anyone's body. Well, what I said back to him was, I appreciate what you're saying. I know that, you know, my colleagues are all well-intentioned, but we all have prejudiced bones. We all have biases because we're all breathing that smog. We're all taking in misinformation. And so it shouldn't surprise us if sometimes that smog makes itself known. You know, if we breathe it in, sometimes we're going to breathe it out. And I am concerned, and I shared my concerns about what was going on. Well, that was an easier conversation to have as a tenured faculty member than it would have been if I were untenured. But still, it was a conversation that he was receptive to, in the sense that, you know, he didn't start yelling at me, but I'm not sure it made a difference. It certainly didn't make a difference in the outcome of that search. So, but I felt like I did what I had to do in speaking up about it. There are times, however, when you decide this is not the right place for me. And so I eventually left that organization and moved on to another one, which was a much better fit. In an ideal world, the institution is working to retain its faculty. You know, you've been hired because they want to retain you, or you've been selected as a graduate student because they believe you can be successful. But sometimes the environment is hostile, and if you can't find support from colleagues and administrators to make it a tenable situation for you, sometimes you have to think about being someplace.
Thank you for that, Dr. Tatum. And I'll pose what will be the last question from the audience before I hand it back to Dean Alavi. Does multiracial engagement in the Black Lives Matter movement, especially of younger people, suggest that they are more open to the dialogue across race? How should we capitalize on this moment in history?
Well, I certainly do think that and many people have referenced, and I would too, reference the fact that the protests we've seen this summer have been so multiracial, and that's something different, right? That is new, that there's been much more white participation in those protests than I recall seeing in my experience over the last years. And so I think it is potentially encouraging I think that we all need to be speaking up in order to make change happen and for it to be long lasting. Sometimes I think it's important to say, and I said we all need to be speaking up, and in an ideal world we would all be speaking up. But the truth of the matter is we don't all have to speak up in order to make change happen. You know, if you look at social movements, it's never been 100% of the people who were in favor of the change. We don't have to wait for 100% to make it happen. But we do need to have a critical mass. And I think the fact that so many people are now trying to educate themselves, it's been quite striking if you look at, you know, what books are being purchased. You know, the New York Times bestseller list at 1.9 out of the 10 books on the bestseller list were about race or racism. People were really trying to learn more and educate themselves. And that says to me that awareness is being raised, and awareness, hopefully, ideally, leads to action. We all need to be thinking about how to use our own spheres of influence to bring about the change we want to see. We can't wait for somebody else to do it. We have to be focused on it and working in partnership with others, but not waiting for 100%, but getting ready to take the action we can with the allies we have.